Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Vanishing Hour. I'm super excited to be recording today because today I actually have somewhat privacy to record. I'm usually holed up in a closet sweating profusely or just flat out recording with other people in the room, and it's usually extremely awkward, but today, no, not today. Today is freedom. No time restraints, no clackety-clack of a keyboard that isn't my own, or muffled children's screams for the most part. I originally started recording this while they were at school. They have since come home, so you may be catching a few children's wails in the background. But regardless, there are a few things I want to go over before we get into today's episode. If you haven't already done so, please feel free to like, follow, subscribe, whatever your platform of choice requires of you to do. Always feel free to leave any criticisms you may have, so long as they are constructive and not destructive. I am open to any and all case suggestions. I have received a few messages regarding that. I am always open to any that you may offer or have a desire to hear about. Now, I usually go for cases that are lesser known or may have dimmed in recent years because I do want to provide coverage for cases that both require it and deserve it and are maybe not receiving it. Yes, we sometimes will cover popular cases too. That's just the name of the game when it comes to true crime. But regardless, every victim deserves coverage. However, there is, again, more of an attention to lesser covered or known cases when I can do it. Now, the crux of this, though, is the lack of information. Without being able to delve on a professional level yet, it leaves you with the public information to sort of sort through on cases. The less info that there is, the harder it is to research and come back with valid information. But please always feel free to suggest cases, share cases, or just speculate right along with us. Plus, on a much less important level, it lets me engage with you guys, and that's always kind of cool too. Anyways, I am eager to jump in today's case. Guys, this was a journey. I struggled for the past week to find a case to work on, or to really land on a case, I should say. My process, as I've mentioned in the past, is a weird one. I usually let the case choose itself for the week or the month or whatever time frame I am working in. Usually it's a no-brainer. I'll have several screaming at me all at once. This week, however, was not the case. I had several I was eyeballing, but I just couldn't sink any hooks into any. They all felt like they just weren't the right time to be covered. So I set them aside, and I started to get a bit anxious. I overloaded myself one evening with so much unsolved crime and, just bad shit that I started to become hyper paranoid, and I couldn't sleep, and it became bad. So I let off the gas, and I was just like, let's let it go for a bit, push the deadline for another episode out a little further, and obviously when it's ready, it'll come to me. And so I did that. And I shit you not, within 24 hours, we had our case. No sooner than I nestled into my couch, turned on the TV, started browsing through Netflix to see if maybe perhaps Volume 3 of Unsolved Mysteries had dropped yet, which, by the way, I haven't started yet, but Season 1 was so good. Season 2 was a little meh, but I'm excited for Season 3. And no sooner did I check out the revamp of Disappeared, in case there's any fans out there for the TV show. It's back, but it's much different somehow. And also, no sooner did I check the favorite TV show of mine, Still a Mystery. I advise you all to check it out if you haven't already done so. They cover several cases that we've actually featured on here as well. But regardless, no sooner did I check all of those, get on the couch, get comfy, and try to relax a little bit, that this case came crashing into my brain and said, it's time. This is the one. Ironically, it was none of the ones I had been considering. This one was one I had on my list of hundreds of cases that I planned to cover at some point. I had heard of it originally maybe 10 years ago, but I hadn't done any recent research into it until now. And boy, am I glad that I did. I think there's a lot to discuss here. key things that seem to have been overlooked for what I can only imagine are dumb reasons. Guys, maybe you've heard of this case as well. If not, you certainly will not forget it after today. Ladies and gentlemen, this is The Vanishing of Jennifer Servo. Jennifer Servo was born Jennifer Lynn Olson to parents Norm and Sherry. She was their youngest daughter and the heart of their family. She grew up in rural Montana in the logging community of Columbia Falls, population no more than 4,000 people. She was a small town girl, but with big town dreams. Her family knew from the beginning that she was a gifted child. She loved to read, she loved to write, she was extremely musically inclined, playing both the baritone sax and the flute throughout her childhood. She had a spunky sense of humor and was very warm and welcoming just by nature. She was ambitious and showed little fear, and she was strong and sometimes maybe even a little hard-headed. When she had made a decision, she often stuck with it to see it through. Like many children, myself included, Jennifer struggled with the divorce. I'm stuttering. The divorce of her parents as a teenager. The split caused an already aching divide between her and her father to grow even bigger, eventually reaching a point where they hardly ever spoke. This rift led Jennifer to eventually change her last name from Olson to her mother's maiden name of Servo. Her father later recalls how much that hurt, but he never held it against her. He understood how she felt, and while he knows he may not have been a perfect parent, he has loved her unconditionally since the day she was born. At the age of 17, Jennifer had made some pretty big decisions in her life. She knew that she wanted to attend college, and the Army Reserves provided that opportunity for her in her mind. She approached her mother, Sherry, and asked for permission to join. While hesitant and not really on board with the idea initially, Sherry didn't want to stand in the way of her daughter's dreams. She signed off on the papers, and with that, Jennifer was officially in the Army Reserves. Being a part of the reserves allowed Jen to attend college for her true passion, which was writing and journalism. She enrolled at the University of Montana, and while attending there, she was still able to make her monthly infantry trainings in Missoula. Jennifer thrived at both responsibilities in school and in the reserves. In her almost 6 years enlisted, she was promoted to squad leader and respected by many of her peers. There is a plane overhead, and I have my window wide open, so I am sorry if you can hear that. I will do my best to edit that out. But like I said, she was respected by many of her peers, both in school and in the reserves. She also worked for the campus radio television department while also reporting for both Montana Public Radio KUFM and Missoula's KECI TV. This woman was busy, I can assure you. It was in these jobs, though, that Jen really solidified the notion of becoming a news reporter. This was ultimately where her heart was, and she was determined to follow this path in life. Graduating in 2002, Jen left the university with her degree and immediately began applying for full-time positions throughout the country, looking for a news reporter position. She submitted her recorded segments and crossed her fingers in hopes for a response. It didn't take long for her to get a response from a local news station in the small town of Abilene, Texas, more than 1,600 miles south of her home in Montana. However, without hesitation, she accepted and began preparations for this new job. Now, aside from her professional life, Jen had a lot going on in her personal life at this time as well. She had been dating longtime college boyfriend Dave Warren, and they had at some point recently broken up but remained on very good terms. They were very close friends who communicated regularly. And after this breakup, it's not exactly clear when per se, but sometime between late May and very early July of 2002, Jennifer began seeing a man by the name of Ralph. Ralph was a former Army Ranger who was 12 years older than Jen, making him 34 at the time of their meeting, Jen being only 22. One source pinpointed a little more definitively to this date being about mid-June, which seems to line up with everything. An issue that seems ever consistent with this case is minute details differing from source to source, though. In all of the cases I've researched, both for this podcast and just for the sake of it, I haven't come across a case with more differing accounts of seemingly small details. And that does make me wonder how small these details actually are when we really look at the case. And we'll go over that in a little bit. However, with that being said, I had noticed that one source, in particular, a book titled Girl in the Grave and Other True Crime Stories by Carlton Stowers, states that Ralph and Jen met at the university where he was working in the lab animals research department. Oddly enough, I couldn't find any other source that corroborated these statements, a theme that I encountered a lot with this book. Instead, the general consensus stated that they met through Jen's monthly reserve training, which seems to make a little bit more sense to me. It's hard to say, being that Ralph was allegedly already discharged from the Rangers at this time, but there's nothing else backing that he worked for or that they may have met on campus in any way. But regardless, they met sometime between late May and early July, most likely mid-June time, and they started a relationship. It is known, though, that by July 4th of that year, Jen had made the decision to bring Ralph home for the family to meet. Now, there's no doubt that Ralph did not hit it off with the parents immediately. It doesn't sound like it was any fault of his own initially. They just weren't accustomed to the type of guy that Ralph was. Jen's family was not crazy about the age gap, nor did they care for his quote-unquote bad boy persona, which I found a little laughable initially. Despite him having a clean record, both with law enforcement and in the Rangers, which, by the way, is no easy task. Rangers are held to a higher standard, similar to how the Navy has the SEALs, the Army has its Rangers, among other intensive programs that they offer for more of what they call quote-unquote premier soldiers. I did read a statistic that stated that less than half of the soldiers that do enter into the Rangers program actually completed and graduate from it. So it's not easy. It appears that they are usually tasked with some of the more dangerous and physically and mentally demanding jobs that the Army is in charge of doing. So the fact that Ralph had a clean law enforcement record within the community and obviously a clean record while he was a part of the Army goes to show that the whole bad boy persona didn't necessarily apply to who he actually was at that time. It sounds like the bad boy persona stemmed more from the fact that he was older than her and he was definitely tattooed on the arms profusely. I'll say that. Coming from someone who is probably equally covered in tattoos and piercings, this is always a very annoying stereotype that is received far too often. Ralph didn't fit the typical guy that Jen went for. I think it was just simply that. But it sounds like that's kind of what drew her to him in the first place. It was something new, something unknown and mysterious, and let's be real, ladies, we all fall for it at one point in our lives or another, myself included. Regardless, though, Jen was smitten with Ralph in the first weeks of their relationship, and it seemed like the feeling was mutual for Ralph as well. So when the offer from Abilene came in and Jen immediately accepted it, it seemed like a no-brainer for Ralph to follow the girl he was falling for. He decided to completely uproot his life, both career, home, car, everything, and relocate to Texas with Jen. Now, I think for the average person, this seems extreme. And for the average person, I would agree. It's a scary thing to leave everything behind for many people. But what I think people didn't really factor in as a possibility for Ralph was that this guy spent the majority of his adult life never really laying roots anywhere. He was in the army for most of this time, and he was constantly stationed at different parts of the country and even the world. Roots just aren't something you easily lay down in this type of lifestyle. That's not to say that people don't do it, but it is a less common thing to do for single men. So he was probably an expert at picking up and leaving by this point in his life. It's also about this point in the story, though, where we start to develop a more physical timeline of events. Because unfortunately, in about roughly 60 days from this point, Jennifer will be dead. Tuesday, July 16th, 2002. Jen and Sherry have decided to depart from Montana with a U-Haul full of Jen's things, and from some accounts, it sounds like Sherry's Buick as well. This source stated that she planned on leaving the car with Jen so she would have a vehicle to get to and from work while she got more acclimated to the new town. The first night of their trip, they made it to northern Wyoming, where they lodged at a motel for the evening. The following day, they decided to drive straight through without taking any breaks, and they arrived in the early morning hours of Thursday, July 18th in Abilene. Sherry recalls feeling like they were both out of place in this town initially. It just seemed so barren and quiet and empty. However, after finding a motel to catch some shut-eye in and waking up refreshed and ready to set out for a day of apartment hunting, things did seem to turn around for Sherry and Jen as they felt a lot more welcomed in the town once it was awake and alive with people bustling around. They did find one apartment well within Jen's budget at the Hunter's Ridge Apartments. The Hunter's Ridge Apartments are located not far out of town, just a few miles. They were close within driving distance to her job, and they seemed to be located in an area that was well kept and seemingly safe, so it seemed like a good option. The apartment itself was a 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom, small, simple style, and Jen fell in love with it. They signed the lease on the spot, and Jen was able to move in that day. Afterwards, her and Sherry did a little shopping to sort of stock up on any immediate needs that Jen may have. This did include Sherry buying a bed for Jen that would be delivered in the coming days. That night, both women brought Jen's belongings into the home, and they shared their first meal of homemade spaghetti together. Now, sometime between July 18th and July 20th, Ralph arrived in his rental car, bringing Jen's beloved cat, Mr. Binks, with him. I found this to be a very interesting tidbit. The book I mentioned earlier kind of painted the picture of Jen and Ralph already being on negative terms as they moved to Texas. The book insinuated that Jen was already wanting to split up with Ralph. However, he had convinced her that Texas could be sort of a do-over for them to start over fresh, and eventually Jen reluctantly agreed. I feel like this account may be inaccurate. This is just my personal feeling, because literally all the other sources indicated that those feelings in Jen didn't really start to develop until after the move together. Her entrusting him to bring her cat for her, a cat she treasured and adored, kind of corroborates that. She knew him for such a short time, but trusted him with bringing Mr. Binks. I wouldn't entrust my cat to a dude I was already not thrilled was moving with me. Also, I didn't get the impression that Jen had any problems turning dudes away. She was very straightforward, and we will see more of that later on in her story here. I also wanted to add to this because I have yet to find anyone who has covered this case and pointed it out, but there's one photo of Jen and Ralph that has been extensively used for coverage of this case. It's a photo of Jen and him standing side by side, both beaming at the camera on a nice sunny day in casual clothes. There's no tension, there's no tense body language, everybody seems to be relaxed and happy. But I think what people have failed to notice is the door that's right behind them. It's the front door to Jen's new apartment. If I was moving 1,600 miles away and being followed by my clingy boyfriend who I didn't want to come with me in the first place, this picture probably wouldn't be in existence, guys. I'm not going to commemorate a moment I didn't want to make in the first place. Most likely, if this were me, this photo would have been of just me, or depending on when it was taken, me and my mom. I'm just saying. So, by July 20th, Ralph, Jen, and Mr. Binks are all in Texas, settling in nicely. Sherry feels confident that she's helped set her daughter up for success here in this new town. And since arriving, it has really warmed up to her. She said everyone was friendly and welcoming, and the town was clean and well taken care of, and she felt safe leaving her daughter here as she flew back to Montana. July 22nd was Jen's first day on the job as the news reporter for Abilene. For a lot of people, definitely myself included, a huge move like this would have had me all sorts of nervous and anxious and antisocial in the beginning. But I'm not a very extroverted person in any way. I'm awkward and I struggle coming off as like a level-headed person when you first meet me. I can't tell you how many times I've been told, wow, when I first met you, I totally thought you were going to be a horribly mean bitch. It's really just my face. It naturally falls into this like angry, resting bitch face somehow. It's comfortable there, and we're just gonna leave it like that. But Jen, however, didn't suffer from the same thing. She was just completely adaptable. Sorry, just knocked over my water bottle. She didn't fear social situations, obviously, because not only did she pursue a career that had her in the public eye, but she also just liked meeting people and making friends. She was a natural at it, and that greatly benefited her here. She showed up and just clicked with everyone immediately. They all loved her and felt like she was a natural addition to their team. One person on her new team in particular became instantly infatuated with the blonde beauty. His name was Brian. Brian was a year older than Jen and was also fairly new to the area and to the station, having previously lived in Virginia and accepted a position as a meteorologist for the same station as Jen. Brian and the group couldn't help but be drawn into Jen, and the feeling was mutual for Jen and her new social group. But while things were blossoming for Jen at work and in her social life, things started to take a bit of a nosedive for her and Ralph at home. While Ralph seemed to willingly want to move here and had no qualms about it and had this whole plan hatched, it seems that he started to develop a more possessive nature towards Jen that was just not appealing at all. Some of Jen's friends have stated that their relationship quickly started to feel suffocating to Jen because despite Ralph's original promises of landing a job and contributing and kind of having his own life here, he hadn't had much success in the first weeks, and that left him kind of lounging around the house all day, not really doing much, and that contributed to Jen feeling suffocated. It also didn't help that now that their lightning speed relationship had been moved into a very intimate place of now living together so quickly in a new area, they started to realize how different they actually were and preferences that they both had. Apparently, this included their sexual preferences. Jen had expressed to a friend that Ralph liked more of the rough sex, and that included some level of choking, and she was not feeling that at all. Listen, guys, we're not here to judge. We all like what we like, so long as it is mutual and consensual. It sounds like they just started to clash on more personal levels than they had originally realized. This divide between them began to push Jen more towards her social group of friends and further away from Ralph, which is understandable. Eventually, things came to a head, though, when just a few short weeks after the move to Texas, a bombshell was dropped on Jen. It's unclear how exactly it came out. One source said that Ralph revealed it, but another source stated that Jen just somehow found out. Either way, it became known that Ralph had in fact left behind a whole-ass fiancé in Montana and a child he hardly saw, unbeknownst to Jen. It's unclear if he split from the fiance prior to dating Jen, or if this was like a, hey, I was engaged while we were together up there, but now I'm not sort of thing. It was also stated in one source that the child that was mentioned was actually with a woman separate from the fiance as well. All of this information was extremely overwhelming and off-putting for Jen. I imagine that she was already struggling with the relationship, but when this was found out, it was like the straw that broke the camel's back sort of deal. Suddenly, you're looking at this person in front of you and you don't know them at all. Everything that once drew you to them initially seems insignificant, or maybe more like a lie in some ways. And to an extent, you're right in feeling that way. Ultimately, this revelation led Jen to the decision to break up with Ralph and to ask that he move out immediately. This occurred roughly between mid-July and mid-August, according to our timeline, and that's just a very rough general time frame. Now, I do want to make it clear, this was grimy of Ralph. I think we can all agree on that, and we can all be a little mad at him for that 100%. But I do think that it needs to be said that there's a very clear and big difference between being a scuzzy, grimy boyfriend and being something more than that. And let's please keep that in mind. Regardless, by all accounts, Ralph respected Jen's wishes and he moved out. It didn't take him long to find his own place, land his own job at a manufacturing plant nearby, and to purchase his own vehicle. Within a very short time, he made himself completely independent from her, and according to friends and Jen herself, he maintained his distance and he left her alone. She never voiced any concerns or issues she was having with him post-breakup. Now, it was stated that around August 17-ish, presumably a few weeks post-breakup, leading us to believe the breakup was more close to the end of July, that Ralph reached out to Jen one last time asking for a second chance. She politely declined, but it was stated that they agreed to remain good friends and things were amicable between the two of them. With the end of their relationship, that allowed Jen to direct her full attention to her new job and her new friends. Some coworkers had expressed that good old Brian was maybe a good rebound, I guess, for Jen. It was obvious to everyone, including Jen, that Brian was really into her, and by Brian's own accounts, he had expressed that interest to Jen directly. One source stated that sometime in mid to late August, her and Brian actually began somewhat of a physical relationship. One friend said that Jen confided in her that there was an incident where her and Brian had made out in one of the workrooms at the station. It sounds like that didn't really develop any further desire to be anything more than just good friends, because according to Jen, she had made it clear to him that she just wanted to remain good friends, and Brian has since corroborated that statement. However, there are a difference in stories, though, and that seemed to have caught my attention. In an interview, Brian said that he was totally okay with the fact that Jen was just looking for more of a friendship. However, her friends and other sources close to both of them had stated that Brian was still fairly persistent in pursuing Jen, and that Jen had stated that she did like him, but she didn't want to hurt his feelings, and she wasn't looking for a relationship. To me, that sounds like a shutdown. And to say that that was a mutual thing, it does seem slightly off center, Brian. Just saying. Regardless, though, it is clear that Brian and Jen continued to spend a lot of time together, both in a group setting with other friends and also just one-on-one. One particular interaction that stood out was in early September of 2002. Jen and Brian decided to take a day trip to Roswell, New Mexico. They spent the day there together and decided to head back home in the evening. According to Brian, on the ride home, he had asked Jen how things were going with Ralph regarding the breakup and if she had encountered any issues. While he says that she stated no issues at the time, she allegedly made the mention of the fact that she needed to get in contact with him regarding returning her house key. I find this odd. and I'll go over it why in a little bit, but just make a mental note of that. So moving forward in our timeline here, we are now up to Friday, September 13th, 2002. The day carries on as usual. Jen worked, and at some point during the day, she spoke to her mother over the phone, which was sadly their last conversation. Jen's mother makes no mention of anything alarming or off about Jen, her conversation, or anything of that nature. Mothers are usually the ones to pick up on that sort of thing because they know their children better than anyone. But Sherry had nothing. And this just kind of compounds the fact that days prior to her death, Jen wasn't having issues that she felt she needed to express to the people she trusted the most. Things were normal. Saturday, September 14th, a coworker states that when she asked about Ralph, Jen stated she hadn't seen or spoken to him since he had asked for a second chance, but that she was planning on emailing him because he hadn't been to their shared P.O. box recently to pick up his mail and it was beginning to pile up a bit. I find this interesting because, according to Brian, days before this, she had made mention that she needed a key returned and that she needed to reach out to him. Yet she doesn't mention the key in this interaction with the coworker. If anything, I feel a key is much more detrimental to have returned to you than somebody just picking up mail at a shared P.O. box. Maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like if the key was an actual thing, it would have been mentioned here in this conversation with the coworker who brought up Ralph. Yet it wasn't. Either way, both stories indicate that Ralph was leaving Jen alone and that she wasn't in distress regarding him or the situation regarding him at all. Both stories also point out that Jen wasn't the one bringing him up either. People were asking, but Jen wasn't actively talking about him. This indicates to me that she had no reason to bring him up. He wasn't bothering her, and again, this is important to note as well. So now, we're up to Sunday, September 15th, 2002. Jen worked a 10-hour shift that day that ended sometime around 10 p.m. Sherry had attempted to call her daughter throughout the day but was unable to reach her. This wasn't odd because she was aware that she was working a 10-hour shift and that it would be late in the day. When 10 p.m. rolled around, Jen and Brian had made plans to run some errands after work. Multiple sources varied regarding who and where, but Jen was planning on picking up a coffee table from what seems to be a mutual coworker who was getting rid of one, among some other household items like a paper towel dispenser and a banana hammock or a banana rack. You know, the ones you hang them on so that they don't rot as fast. I have one. They still rot at the same rate. They're pointless, to be honest with you. Anyway, regardless, Brian was apparently tagging along in his own car. So after picking up the items from the coworker's home, both Jen and Brian headed to a nearby Walmart, again in separate cars, in order to do some shopping. Brian needed groceries for himself, and Jen wanted to stock up on some cat food for Mr. Binks. Now this is where I wonder about something, and this is probably the extent of my speculation, I think. But Walmart footage corroborates that at precisely 10:45 p.m., Jen and Brian are in the store together. She is still alive at this point, so we obviously know she left work safely and she got to Walmart safely. This is the last physical footage we have of her alive, and it is said that Brian is with her. But the footage has never actually been physically released to my knowledge for public view. The only thing that seems to have been released is a very blurry and a very fuzzy still shot from the footage. In that image, Jen is dressed in what appears to be a white or light-colored dress with purse in hand. You see the timestamp below her indicating the time that was mentioned above. There's a shopping cart that seems to be rolling behind her. And Brian is alleged to be the half a body that's walking maybe 4 feet behind her. I say half a body because his head is cut out of the frame. But it's clearly a man dressed in black pants and a blue, maybe long sleeve shirt. They are not walking side by side. She is ahead of him. She doesn't appear to be looking back as she's like trying to talk to him or waiting for him. She is in mid stride, continuing forward. He seems to be reaching out for the cart that's in between the two of them. So obviously, without further context, this could just be a moment where they were briefly separated as he went to grab a cart and she continued forward. But without context, that leaves me to speculate. My impression looking at the image, it made me wonder if there was some vital context missing from this. I'm not a body language expert, don't quote me on any of this, but when I looked at it, I felt tension looking at the image. It's completely possible that I'm reading it wrong, but it did make me wonder if maybe there was some sort of slight disagreement or maybe an uncomfortable conversation that may have been experienced prior to the image. For two people who are close and hang out regularly and decided to go shopping this late at night together, you expected body language wise for them to be a little bit more closer together, maybe a little bit more engaged, maybe not so, he was so far back from her. It almost didn't look like they were together. That's my impression. And again, that is complete speculation, but it was a thought I wanted to throw out there regardless. Despite the image, the two purchase their goods separately and they exit the store. This is right about the time where the story starts to get weird once again. Now, originally, Brian never mentioned the events I'm about to state to police. It wasn't until roughly a week later, I think, after Jen's death, that he suddenly brought what I'm about to tell you up to police. And it's odd. But according to the book I mentioned, who at various points directly quotes Brian states that as they exited the store, he had a fleeting feeling of being watched, and he recalled briefly noticing a dark-colored four-door sedan departing the area at the time of him feeling this said feeling. But he apparently shrugs it off. He gets in his car, he exits the area, and Jen follows behind him. He heads to his place, and as he's waiting for Jen to arrive, he spots the same four-door sedan and begins to feel that same weird fleeting feeling. But again, he makes the executive decision to not say anything to Jen. The car slowly passes by before speeding away, according to him. Jen obviously arrives, and she allegedly helps him carry his groceries up to his apartment. The woman with a coffee table and other shit and a bag of cat food is helping this dude who probably bought one bag of groceries up to his apartment. The logic is a little questionable. One has to wonder, why did we go back to your place when she clearly had furniture and other things that needed to be brought back to hers? And being the gentleman that you are, why not offer to head back to her place to help her bring any of it in? Obviously, pure speculation, but one has to wonder, right? Why did we have to go back to your place that night? Regardless, according to him, they hung out at his place talking and making plans for the following evening to see a movie before she decides to call it a night. He then offers to walk Jen to her car, quoting, "If something happened to you between here and your car, nobody would ever forgive me," is the statement he makes jokingly. Jen apparently declines, but he insists, after which he gives her a kiss, goodbye, and she leaves his residence. Now, there's a second version of this story, like I said, and it comes from an ABC News article that allegedly interviewed Brian as well. And Brian states that it was Jen who spotted the dark four-doored sedan at Walmart, and that she was the one who had the unsettling feeling about it. But she brings it up to Brian, and Brian subsequently tells her, I think you're just imagining things, just, let it go. And the two subsequently leave Walmart and head again to his place of residence. Upon arrival, Jen swears that she has spotted the four-door sedan passing by the house again and has this unsettling feeling that it's following either her or them. Brian, again, dismisses her concern, thinking it's nothing. He does, however, stick by the claim that when offering to walk her back to her car, she declines, but he yet again insists and walks her to her car, where she departs the area safely. Okay, Brian. I've got issues with all of this. Now, to be fair, I couldn't find anywhere in either source where they linked anything that directly was related to Brian, but they used quotes when referencing what he said. Now, everyone pretty much knows that quotations indicate it came directly from the horse's mouth rather than, just their interpretation of what he said. That's just common sense writing. If Brian did in fact provide interviews for both sources, why are the accounts of these events so vastly different? That's a very big red flag for me. Now, a friend of Jen's from Montana said that when she heard the version of Jen expressing concern about being followed, she found it extremely hard to believe that Jen would turn down a walk to her car that evening. Jen was no fool. She was a safe and cautious woman, as I previously mentioned. She was Army trained, but she was always aware of her surroundings, always locked doors, etc. She wasn't a careless or naive person. So if she had any inkling of danger or potential weirdness that was going on that night, she would not have turned down an escort to her car in the middle of the damn night. This friend stated that this didn't sound like the Jen she knew, and that she basically didn't really believe that version. Now, phone records placed Jen arriving back home at her residence. She made the decision to leave the coffee table in her car that night, which makes sense. It's late, it's heavy, she has to go up a set of stairs in the dark. I wouldn't want to carry it by myself either. You'd probably most likely just want to wait until you have somebody there with you to help you carry it up, just to be on the safe side. But her purse, which we saw with her at Walmart, and her cell phone and her keys were never found in her car, so it was safe to say she probably had brought them with her into the apartment. Sometime around 12:30 a.m., a phone call conversation is held between Jen and Dave, the old college ex-boyfriend, who still remained a close friend of hers that she talked to regularly. It sounds like they both had fairly late schedules, so talking at this time of night wasn't a weird thing by any means. It's unclear who called who, but the call lasts for about an hour. Dave states that it was a normal call by all accounts. They mainly talked about their careers. Dave being a meteorologist in Montana, so they had a very similar career path and much to talk about. They also made plans to possibly meet up in December, just a few short months away, I believe, in Dallas for the holidays. It was either Dallas or Houston, but somewhere, one of the main cities in Texas. Dave says that there was nothing about Jen's conversation, her demeanor, the words she used, or her behaviors that indicated anything was bothering her or wrong. He said at most she may have been slightly homesick, but that she was extremely happy with her current career path and her life. He says that she made no mention of this alleged dark sedan following her just a few hours, if not minutes, earlier than this phone call. This is again odd, because not only was Dave a close confidant of hers and someone she divulged her life to, but also Jen was just someone who would have said something. And he would have, at minimum, have picked up on it if something was bothering her. But again, there was nothing. This is extremely inconsistent with Jen's normal behavior and what Brian alleges happened that night. Anyways, the conversation ends, and that is the last anyone has contact with Jen. According to the Stowers book, there was one neighbor who at some point stated that sometime around 3 a.m. they heard a couple of loud noises coming from Jen's apartment. Now, there's literally no other sources to corroborate this statement, but I'm throwing it in there regardless, just on the off chance that it is true and that it can provide further to this timeline we are trying to create here. The next morning, Brian alleges that he attempted to call Jen several times but got no response. He initially didn't think much of it because he thought she was most likely still tired or sleeping from the night before. However, it sounds like it didn't take Brian long to start jumping to some really wild and odd conclusions. He and the rest of her colleagues knew that she had the next couple of days off. However, the article states that Brian drove to her house sometime that Sunday and attempted to reach Jen and got no response. He called several times. He allegedly left messages. He knocked, but there was no response. He did note that her blinds, which were usually slightly lifted so Mr. Binks could lounge in the windowsill, were pulled completely down and were shut. After several minutes, he decided to depart the area. The article goes on to state that at some point that evening, Brian confided in a mutual colleague that he thought Jen was brushing him off. The colleague allegedly kind of figured that was also what was going on, just based on what Brian was telling them. I can only assume that's because they were aware that Jen wasn't interested in Brian the same way he was interested in her. Now, to an extent, I guess I can understand where Brian's mindset was. But also, it had been less than 24 hours since they had last seen each other. They allegedly had plans for movies that night. Being that Jen had spent so much time with him already, I find it odd that he'd immediately jump to assuming she's blowing him off because he can't get a hold of her. I feel like there wasn't anything that happened within the last 24 hours for him to come to that negative conclusion so quickly, and instead a more logical reaction should have been concern for her, but it wasn't. Regardless, the following morning is when things started to really get odd. Apparently, a last-minute opening at work provided an opportunity for Jen to come in and get some extra hours. Jen was always open and willing to take advantage of more airtime. Her job reached out, and they got no response. They weren't immediately alarmed, but they did think that it was odd because they always got a response from Jen, whether it was, "Yes, I'm coming in," or, "Unfortunately, I can't make it, but next time I got you." A female friend and colleague mentions that her and Jen had plans that day to lay out by Jen's pool and hang out. She headed over to Jen's and was met with the same dilemma Brian had the night before. There was no response to the knocking or the calls. The window blinds were still completely down and shut. Getting an unsettling feeling, she decided to call Brian and request that he come over and help her out. He allegedly had made the comment, "This isn't good." He arrives and they both struggle with what to do next. This female friend states that at some point she noticed the creepy maintenance guy skulking around and that she was unsettled by his presence. Not knowing what else to do, though, she headed to work and talked to their boss and explained the concern that they both had. Their boss shared that concern, and he decided to make the decision to call the management at Jen's apartment buildings and ask for them to possibly enter her apartment to check on her. They waited for a call back, but they never received one. What they did receive was far more sinister. In the editing room, they have a police scanner so as to track activity in town and hopefully be the first on the scene to report. What they heard over the scanner next shook everyone in the room to their very core. They heard police dispatched to Jen's apartment with a possible DOA on site. DOA meaning dead on arrival. The female coworker flew to her car and headed to the scene, allegedly in tears. When arriving, it was clear something awful had happened in Jen's apartment. There were tape cordoning off her building. There was police coming in and out of her apartment itself. The door was wide open. There was an ambulance as well. However, there seemed to be no rush to get anybody to a hospital or medical attention, and this alarmed the friend. Police were not budging on info, but the management at the complex confirmed to this friend that Jen was found dead in the apartment. Brian allegedly showed up a short time later, and to me, it sounds like he made a bit of a scene. Claims of him screaming and throwing his orange juice bottle at a brick wall were made. Police, though, again secured the scene and began their investigation. So Jen's apartment was, again, a small one-bedroom. She didn't utilize the room for much except for storing her belongings, so it essentially acted as a walk-in closet for her. The bathroom was located through the bedroom, and that was the only way to access the bathroom. Jen, instead, kept her bed in the living room / dining room area. That sounds odd to some, but I'm telling you, this was a really small apartment, and my assumption is that it just felt more spacious to be out in the living room area than it did to be in the bedroom. When police arrived, they noticed a blood stain at the foot of her bed, a pretty decently sized one, with red drag marks that led through the bedroom into the bathroom where a similar blood stain was. Reports were unclear on exactly how she was found, but some stated she was in the tub. Others simply stated that she was just in the bathroom. She was found fully clothed with a pair of shorts and a t-shirt on, which was clothing that she was known to usually sleep in. Decomposition and lividity had set in, placing her time of death in the early morning hours of Sunday, shortly after her phone call had ended with her ex Dave, which was now 2 days prior. A quick rundown of the autopsy revealed that her cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, particularly to the front and sides, with no indication to the back of the head. She also had bruising to her neck, and petechiae was noticed in both the eyes and in the throat area. Petechiae is just a fancy word for tiny capillaries that have burst in these said areas, which is very consistent with strangulations. There was also, I think, severe bruising. They didn't say if it was from hands or if it looked like it was from a rope or any sort of similar weapon, but those two injuries were concluded to work in tandem as the cause of death. Oddly, they found minimal defensive wounds on her. I think one source stated that she had had one single broken nail. However, no DNA was found under any of her nails. There have been multiple sources stating that she was sexually assaulted or raped. However, that seems to be relatively unlikely according to official reports. Like I mentioned, she had been found fully dressed, which doesn't rule it out, but usually there will be inconsistencies in clothing on a victim if they were sexually assaulted and then redressed after, and there were no indications of that at the scene. While it was stated that DNA was found at the scene, nothing states DNA was found in or on Jennifer. The only suspicious evidence of sexual assault was bruising in the groin area. It doesn't sound like police have confirmed sexual assault, despite numerous random sources throwing that out there into the public. They have stated that plenty of DNA was found at the scene. I think 6 profiles to be exact. However, complicating that is the fact that there was a reason for some of those DNA profiles to be there, because several individuals were known to be in her home at various points. Also, poor Mr. Binks had contributed inadvertently to a lot of contamination of the scene. So with that being said, I don't think DNA was found in any cavities that would corroborate sexual assault. A few missing items from the scene included her purse, keys, phone. Her mother stated that her flute was missing. However, I didn't find that in any other source. And according to several sources, several random DVDs, which is kind of a brain scratcher. Those DVDs included Sex and the City, seasons 1, 2, and 3. The best seasons, I might add. And the movie Saving Private Ryan. Now, I will state that one source claimed that Brian was brought into the scene and asked if anything was missing, at which point he was the one who pointed out those DVDs. I feel like that's a very odd observation. I also think it's kind of weird that he was brought in. Maybe the police weren't aware at the time that he should have been a suspect and that he is a suspect. And he was just simply there on the scene. It was like, yeah, I'm a friend, and they just were like, oh, okay, can you tell if anything's missing? That's probably how it played out, but it shouldn't have played out because now obviously he's on the suspect list and you just had him trampling through your crime scene claiming things are missing. What if those had already been missing the whole time? We don't know. Regardless, though, I think it's also odd because if I were to put myself in the position of arriving at the scene of a friend or a, love interest and being told, hey, they're dead. Can you come in here and, spot the difference? What's missing? I think my mind is going to be looking for the most obvious things, the things that I know I would be able to identify. I also don't think I'll be walking around with a fucking list of DVDs this person owns and being like, yep, seasons 1, 2, and 3 are missing. Also, Private Ryan's gone. Like, that just, unless he, gifted them to her or something of that nature and he noticed, I think it's odd that that's what he noticed was missing. Now, does this mean anything? Obviously not. It's just an observation I made that I thought was a little weird. But that's just me. Moving on. Lastly, the police noted that there was no sign of forced entry. This indicated the likelihood that Jen knew her attacker and let them in, or that they had access to her apartment. Sadly, family was notified. Preparations for a funeral were made. Everyone was just in total shock, and they weren't prepared for such a horrible blow to their family and friends. The police quickly rounded up a list of people to contact and question. This included family and friends and coworkers. After speaking with all of them, they narrowed a list of suspects down to about 6-ish people. The only publicly named persons on this list were Ralph and Brian for obvious reasons. Dave the ex in Montana was cleared immediately after it was verified that he was in Montana at the time of death. Both Ralph and Brian stated that they were at home at the time of death, with no one to really corroborate this alibi. Police noted Ralph's lack of shock or concern or grief, and that apparently rubbed them the wrong way. Brian, on the other hand, was having a meltdown. Both men offered DNA samples and cooperated with police initially. When released, Brian went home, called his dad, and was told to get an attorney immediately. He did so. Ralph, well, there wasn't really much mention of Ralph after this point, other than the fact that Jen's family was upset that after Jen's death, they never really ever heard from him again. There was no phone call with condolences. He didn't attend the funeral, which was a huge red flag to her family. And yeah, it's scuzzy. I'll admit that. I'd be mad too. But I think it's important to remember that people do grieve differently, and it's not a crime to not show up to a funeral. It's scuzzy, but it's not a crime. Also, as I mentioned before, there's the likelihood that this guy just handled loss differently. Being a ranger who's deployed multiple times on dangerous missions overseas, I personally know plenty of people who have been in similar positions who just become numb to loss. And you can't hold that against them. You can certainly not like it, though, that's for sure. And it's just something that you note. Brian, of course, was extremely present. He attended the funeral and was just an overall wreck. Jen was cremated, ultimately, and was taken back to Montana to have her ashes eventually spread in her hometown that she loved so much. Mr. Binks was sent to live with Jen's father, where he provided comfort for the guilt-stricken father who missed his daughter so deeply. Back in Abilene, it was clear that the full force of the police department was behind this case and ready to solve it. Countless items of evidence were collected. However, it didn't take long for the case to stall out. The medical examiner couldn't conclude what type of weapon was used to beat Jen. Therefore, police didn't know what the fuck they were looking for. Fingerprints were taken from the scene, but none of them stood out to be incriminating. It was clear, though, that the police had a suspect in mind. The family also had their suspect in mind. I'll give you 3 guesses, but you'll only need one. Ralph. This makes sense, but it also boggles me for the same reasons. It makes sense that when a person turns up dead, that the most obvious place you look is the spouses, the boyfriends or girlfriends, the exes, the new love interests. And it makes sense that Ralph came up. There's no denying that. They had recently broke up, her family wasn't a fan, he had access to her home at one point in time. It made sense on a very surface level. But by those same standards, Brian should be a suspect, and he initially was. This should have been further compounded by the fact that he was also the last person to physically see her. And there were differing accounts of their relationship status. But despite all of this, police felt they had a better suspect in Ralph than they did Brian. And according to one source, this was solely based on the fact that Brian just seemed to be more willing to help than Ralph, knocking him down the suspect list a few pegs in their minds. I'm sorry, but if that's actually true, which I seriously hope it's not, that's just flat out ignorance on the investigator's side. Brian's alibi cannot be corroborated any more than Ralph's can be. Ralph was also compliant with the investigation, but as police started hounding him more, he eventually refused to cooperate, as many people do. It can get overwhelming. He eventually accepted re-enlistment into the army a few months later, and he moved away. Police thought this was suspicious. Yet I found that Brian also accepted a position elsewhere months later, but that didn't seem to be mentioned as bothersome to the same investigators. Remember, Brian lawyered up immediately after the alleged advice of his father. A move like this will limit police's ability to freely show up and just question you whenever you want and however they want. Ralph didn't do this, hence the police continuing to bug him until eventually he did lawyer up. You tell me what's more suspicious. Sadly, as time went on, Jen's case quickly fell into the danger of going cold. It appears that Sherry went on a brief rampage of publicly accusing Ralph. I get emotions running high, and you didn't agree with Ralph's actions after Jen's death, and I 100% back that. But I don't think that necessarily excuses you to go on a witch hunt for him without any grounds or solid evidence. My ass would have been spreading that anger and suspicion across all potential suspects equally, and that would have included Brian, who seems to be skating by all of it somehow. The last known tip that came through on Jen's case was not long after her death. Jen's mother received a letter in the mail regarding overdue books on Jen's account at a local library in Montana. Now, this was clearly impossible because Jen had since passed long before these books were ever checked out. This alarmed Sherry, and she shared it with police, and they investigated accordingly. The books in question were 4 philosophy books from the college library that Jen attended in Montana. Being that her purse and wallet were still missing, as well as her phone, it made it plausible that maybe someone was tormenting the police and her family with this library activity. Upon investigation, though, it was revealed that while they couldn't completely rule out suspicious activity, the library system in place allowed enough doubt that that wasn't the case, and that this was most likely an accidental scan of the wrong account when somebody was checking out books. No further activity was ever detected. Honestly, I don't think it was related. To go to the extent of library books and philosophy ones at that At the bare minimum, I think I would be a little bit more suspicious if they were like crime related books or something, insinuating Jen, or like books that she like was known to have checked out, like, some sort of remote connection. But just random philosophy books is just such a far-fetched angle to me. However, though, since then, there's been very little movement, news, or anything pertaining to leads that have been made public in regards to this case. There was a cold case team that was implemented several years back to work on this case. However, this team quietly closed up shop, claiming insufficient funds from the state in order to continue operating. Like I've referenced, there were multiple articles, a book, and even a podcast that has attempted to cover the case in full detail. I highly recommend the podcast. It's called Justice Delayed. The host has been doing their very best to perform their own investigation into Jen's murder. A lot of the issues I'm having with this case were also mirrored in several of those episodes. I haven't listened to all of them. I've maybe listened to 2 or 3, but what is in there is good. She also interviews Jen's mother, and overall, I think she's just done a great job documenting this case. So if you're interested, you should head over and check it out if you want a little more information or background into Jen. Again, it's called Justice Delayed. I'll link it and the other sources in the YouTube description of this case on our YouTube channel. In September of 2022, Jen's case reached its 20th year of being unsolved. Her mother states that the police stopped calling long ago. She fears there's no one actively seeking resolution for her daughter, and I think that's a very valid concern to have at this point. It makes sense. It seems like the police are stuck. And while I'm usually very much in support of investigations performed in law enforcement, however, I do feel that the lack of movement in this case is of the investigator's own doing. I could be completely off, and I hope that I am, and I'll accept if I am. But solely basing off of the public information I have, it sounds like the police got fixated on one angle and one angle only, and they refused to expand their focus. My opinion is that they focused a little too much on one suspect, that they wanted it to be, that they've missed obvious circumstantial evidence indicating an equally plausible suspect. And I want to go over both now. First suspect on our list is obviously going to be Ralph. Why? Well, he's the ex. It makes sense. He lived in her home briefly, and despite breaking up amicably, he did try to rekindle the romance with Jen, who turned him down. Brian alleges Jen stated she never got the key back from him. However, Ralph did tell police that he in fact had given the key back when they broke up, and his story has never changed. There are no inconsistencies in his accounts of any of the events, or anybody else's accounts of the events that included him and Jen. They have always remained consistent and the same. There are questionable behaviors of his, with him not showing up to the funeral and not sending his condolences, that we can all kind of, raise an eyebrow to. There's no doubt. But the police have corroborated the fact that him and Jen had no domestic disputes or calls or complaints to their home while they were together. He has no record, both in the army and in just local law enforcement. By all accounts, Jen even stated that after their breakup, she hadn't seen or communicated with him. Now, you tell me, if a man moves 1,600 miles away to follow you, you break up and he moves out, gets a job, and leaves you alone to the point where you actually need to contact him for him to pick up his mail, how high is the probability that he's plotting your demise? It's not completely out of the realm of possibility, but let's talk it out here. Maybe he witnessed Brian and her that evening and he got jealous. It's obviously certainly a plausible scenario. But in my opinion, it's unlikely, and here's why. Her and Brian had been close from the beginning, from almost the second she broke up with Ralph, really. And it seems as though Ralph was aware of her friendship with Brian. A scorned, jealous lover would usually take every opportunity to harass you after the fact. And Ralph had every opportunity to do so and didn't. They shared a P.O. box, yet he was never there attempting to bother Jen in hopes of running into her. He never showed up at her house unexpectedly or work, annoying her, calling her, or accusing her of anything that would insinuate he had a problem with her moving on. It just isn't there. Even when friends probed about him, Jen specifically said, "I haven't had any issues. I haven't seen or even heard from him." The no forced entry would indicate that perhaps she knew who it was that night and let them in, or that they had a key. Now, I don't think that Jen would have let Ralph in that night. Obviously, I could be completely wrong, but my gut says I'm not. I also believe Ralph when he says that he gave the key back. His actions after their breakup tell me that he was legitimately moving on. He had no reason to hang on to her key, and he was making no attempts to contact her in any way. Jen also never made any mention of him leaving shit behind that he could later use as an excuse to stop by. Hell, he wasn't even picking up his mail. Dude was moving on, just like she was. So some people mentioned that they did find it odd that Ralph stuck around in town after the breakup. First of all, he had nothing, so how was he supposed to go anywhere? His only real option would be to stay and to get a job and try to rebuild so that he could have money to move on, right? And that's what he did. Secondly, I did an address history search on him. He's had many addresses over his lifetime, spanning dozens of states. One address in particular did catch my eye, though. An address in a city in Texas about 200 miles away from Abilene. This stood out because it was registered 1 year prior to Jen's death, long before they ever met. This would insinuate that Ralph had ties to Texas at some point in his life prior to meeting Jen, and that maybe it wasn't so weird for him to continue to reside in the state and move on with his life. The not showing up for the funeral or giving condolences would really be the only thing remotely suspicious to me. But even then, as I mentioned already, it's more common than people realize. People who have been exposed to traumas or PTSD or very high stress situations that I am only assuming he's been exposed to, oftentimes develop a detachment from emotion. They've learned to turn their switch off. It would explain the seemingly brash dumping of his fiancée, the alleged lack of communication with his child, the easy no-brainer move that weirded some people out to Texas, the seemingly easy time he had moving on and not contacting Jen, and the not showing up after her funeral. It all speaks to a pattern of a type of person we may not understand, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist or that it's automatically wrong or a sign of guilt. Overall, while I feel it may make sense to have him as a suspect, I think the reasons vastly differ between why he is and why he should be a suspect. He should be because there's a potential for motive, and his alibi cannot be corroborated. Simple as that. Instead, it seems he's remained a suspect. Only publicly named one, I might add, simply because the police and the family don't like him. Let's move on to Brian. Brian is the other suspect, and in my opinion, the more logical one. It's clear Brian was infatuated with Jen. It also has been made clear that he was aware that Jen just wanted to be friends. However, there seems to be some sort of indication that Brian wasn't fully convinced of that. The day after the last time he saw her, he immediately jumped to the conclusion that she was blowing him off despite having plans with him that day, and it only being a few hours since they last saw each other. That's a weird jump for me. Also, she had already turned you down. There's no letting you down or blowing you off if you're not dating and you've already been let down. That exchange with the coworker about this concerns indicated to me that Jen and Brian were not on the same page regarding their relationship as much as people may have originally thought. The other issues are the obvious inconsistencies with Brian's retelling of the events to multiple sources. Obviously, there is a level of unsureness regarding this because I cannot confirm with these different sources if these contradicting accounts were directly from Brian's mouth. However, they're presented in both sources as if they are directly from his mouth, so I have no choice but to operate under that assumption. It is my belief that Jen never saw a car following her that night. I don't even think Brian did. Jen would have mentioned it to Dave. She wouldn't have turned down an escort to her car. And honestly, this detail just doesn't add up. But there's a lot of details about Brian's story that just doesn't add up. He said that they had made plans the next day for a movie. He shows up at her house, and not being able to contact her and noticing unusual behavior at her home with the blinds, instead of reporting it or even mentioning it to friends, he instead concludes she's dumping me or avoiding me or whatever. He doesn't bring up the car the night before or the fact that he can't reach her now and that they have plans and that this isn't like Jen to blow anyone off without contacting them and letting them know. Instead, it's this whole poor me, she's avoiding me. And that's a very odd leap to make. The fact that police felt his reaction was genuine and Ralph's lack of reaction suspicious ironically makes me suspicious of Brian. To read his reactions of screaming and crying and throwing a bottle of orange juice at a wall and, being described as this broken man, it's just as weird as the lack of emotion from Ralph. I fully understand that you can get extremely close to people in a short amount of time. I also completely understand being distraught at their unexpected passing. But not even the closest of friends and family were described as this out of hand. On top of it, he goes home, calls his dad of all people, and is like, yeah, you know what, Dad, you're right, I should get a lawyer. They're suspecting me as a suspect, and, that's my number one concern. Like, it all just smells ever so slightly rotten. Another couple of odd notes I made were the inconsistent reportings of sexual assault. My understanding is that she wasn't. That does seem to slightly sway the idea that a romantic interest was the culprit, but only slightly. Lividity settled on the front side of her body, meaning when her heart stopped beating, at a minimum of 30 minutes later, she had to have been resting face down. Lividity is the pooling in blood in the body after the heart stops pumping it throughout, and it can help contribute to time of death as well. The injuries insinuate she wasn't ambushed from behind. She was hit either from the side of the head or from the front, and these injuries possibly rendered her unconscious, but at the very least were disorienting for her. They were the cause of the blood loss, and judging by the blood patterns in the home, this part of the attack occurred in the living room area beside her bed. It's unclear of the strangling and where it occurred as well, if it was in the living room or if she was dragged to the bathroom and then strangled there. Some sources suspect that the dragging to the bathroom was a way to prevent her body from being seen from the windows. While the blinds were closed, it's possible the culprit was worried that Mr. Binks might shuffle them and make them easier to see through, either from the living room or the bedroom. That hypothesis makes sense to me. That would also mean that this person would have to have known that her cat was prone to peeking through the window. That speaks to somebody who knows her pretty well. Her purse, keys, and phone are missing and remain missing. But it is odd, considering there were no signs of robbery as a motive. I think the keys were the goal. The purse and phone just happened to tag along. I think that she might have kept her keys and phone in her purse after using them, And being that the door was locked when she was discovered, again, either the person had their own key, which Brian tried to insinuate that Ralph still had his, although Jen never mentioned that he did. The only thing she ever mentioned was the mail. Or the person needed her keys in order to lock the door behind him. Her credit cards and phone have never been used. Her purse never found. I think the culprit grabbed the purse with the keys in it and left, using the keys to lock the door behind them. This makes sense because the prints on the purse and keys, if left behind, would be hard to excuse as opposed to, just on a counter or glass if they were a regular visitor in her home. In the end, I think there needs to be a harder look at Brian. I'm not saying ignore Ralph, but if you're on Ralph for reasons you can't also rule out for Brian, we have a problem. I'd also like to have a closer look done to both men's personal lives from people directly within their circles, whether it's past lovers, old friends, old colleagues. What I would be looking for would be a pattern of behavior. Did either men show, jealous-like tendencies? Did any of them have, a tendency to kind of misconstrue situations where they wanted to be more than friends and, you didn't want the same thing? What I think is crucial to narrowing down the suspect pool is working the motives that both represent and establishing, well, if this is the motive, what patterns of behavior would support this type of motive. In Brian's situation, we would be looking for people who maybe have had, interactions with him where he did misconstrue friendships or maybe came off a little too strongly. Or, did he have, anger issues or anything of that nature that maybe mirrors his relationship with Jen. And regarding Ralph, we would be looking for maybe patterns of jealousy or entitlement or taking breakups roughly. If there's any patterns of, coming back to homes that he shared with you and, attempting to enter in, these are things we need people who know the suspects to come forward with. And I have a feeling a lot haven't because they're afraid that by coming forward with that information, it makes that person look more guilty when they genuinely believe the person hadn't done that. And while I can understand that fear, at the end of the day, if one of these men are guilty of this crime, you're doing nobody any favors by protecting them. Plain and simple. I will be following this case closely, patiently awaiting updates or further info that I can provide for you all. In the meantime, I urge anyone who may have helpful information to come forward. You can remain anonymous. That's all I have for you guys for now. Sorry for some of the stuttering. Sorry for some of the mush mouth. It's been a very long day. But until next time, guys, please stay safe.